Hey everybody, so today I am talking about how to apply background images and graphics in your websites. And I wanted to remind you that this is a requirement for your final website that you employ a background image or graphic in at least one of your HTML elements. So remember that an HTML element would be something like the body element or a div element or the header element or a list item. So any one of those HTML tags that we've been working with throughout the semester is also referred to as an element. And when we apply HTML or background images or graphics to an HTML element, it means that we are using CSS to deliver that image instead of using the image tag to put an image into the foreground. And just another quick reminder is that there is a difference between having a foreground image, which is content on our website, and a background image, which would be purely there to give decoration and to increase or enhance the presentation of the website visually. So what we're going to be talking about today is really about how to work with background images for decorative presentation. So I'm going to start off today inside of this page on Canvas where I go over some of the main things that I think you need to know about working with background images and graphics before we get started on the tutorial, which will be a separate video. So inside of this page in Canvas, I wanted to go over some of these bullet points about the qualities of background images and graphics. Again, they can be added to almost any HTML tag that you might be working with, such as the div or the header or a list item. And these are some of the things that we want to know about them. So the first thing is that we don't give background images alternative text. So they will not be accessible, visible, or understood by anybody who can't see who is not loading images or graphics with their browser. So if they're using a non-graphical browser. So this is one of the main reasons why we are not going to be using content images inside of our or through CSS as a background, and that's because they won't be seen and they won't be interpreted by people who don't have the privilege of sight. Moving down, the next one in here is that background images do not take up any physical space. What we're used to when we apply an image using an image element is that that image takes up space on the screen and other items cannot be occupying the same space that they occupy. So they're part of the normal document flow, which means that when we put content into our code, it's going to show up in a specific order with block elements taking up space and owning the whole block, and inline elements flowing in line with the content. So when we're working with background images, they don't actually expand, open an element. So if my image was really big and my element was very small, the element is not going to grow to accommodate that image or graphic being brought in through CSS. The element will still remain small, or whatever scale it is, to open and hold its content, and the image would be behind it, but we would see it much like a window. So the image is back behind, being very large, but in the foreground, we only have a very small element. So we're only going to see a portion of that background image. Can we change that? Yes, we can. We could scale that image using the height and width properties inside of our CSS to create a different dimension for the element. So if we were trying to accommodate an image that was this large, but our content inside of our element only expands our element this big, we could actually scale that element to have the same width and height as the background behind it. Therefore, we would be opening up that window, making it larger so that we could see the full image behind. We will be taking a look at that today. A couple of other things that you should know about. One is that the background images can repeat, and in fact, by default, they do repeat like a pattern. So they're going to tile across and tile down until they fill up and occupy the space inside of the element. Let's go ahead and take a look at this. This is CSS Tricks, and looking in our at some of these examples in here, let's take a peek at the demo. So if this is the element that we are working with in here, you can see that when we add in a single image, let's pretend actually this is true, but this is the singular background graphic in here. What it wants to do is it is going to repeat across in rows and down in columns until it doesn't have any more room to repeat, or the window can't see any more of them. We can also repeat only on the x-axis, and we can repeat only on the y-axis. We can also set the background repeat to no repeat, and in that case we end up with just a singular image or graphic representation. So yes, we can repeat. Yes, they usually repeat, but do we have control over it? We do. Background images can also be positioned and moved around in the window that is created by the HTML element. So in the last example where we saw a single background graphic that was tiled and repeating both horizontally and vertically, and we also saw an example where there was just one singular graphic in the background. We can take that graphic and we can move that around within the window that the element creates. Let's take a look at some background images that have been positioned here. So what we're looking at on the Mozilla Developer Network website right here are some examples of an element in here with an image in the background, and we're going to be taking a look at how it's been positioned. So currently the background position for this one is top and left. You can see that without saying anything else, at the top it goes to the center of the top, and when it's set on the left it goes to the center vertical on the left. We can also set it to just be the center. And so what we're seeing right now is that the middle of the graphic, which would be right here, is targeted right over the middle of the element, which would be the center point or the origination point of this box. We can also position it 25% over on this x-axis, but 75% down on the y-axis. So this right here would be referring to the x-axis, and the 75 would be where would it be on the y-axis. We can also set a number of other properties. So this one is bottom 50% and off the right edge 50 pixels, and on the right edge it's off 100 pixels. And then we have another which is using percentages instead of pixels here. So off the right edge 35%, off the bottom 45%. So in addition to being able to position our background images, we can also work with them to have them either scroll with the content. So as I am scrolling in here, you're seeing that the graphics that are in the background are either scrolling with the content, which they are, but we also have some opportunity to actually fix the background to the screen, and then the content will scroll over the top of that. Sometimes we refer to that as parallax scrolling, especially when the speed of the content moving over the top and the speed of the background images are moving at different rates. So let's take a look at what a background, fixed background looks like. So here's an example here where we have a background image. So the image in here of the figure from the back is an image that has been placed into the content, or into the site using CSS, so it's not actually content. We do have content in the foreground, which is going to be this little button, and I can see in here that this is real HTML content. The background graphic, though, image I cannot get to. Now, as I scroll down, you can see that the image stays fixed and the content is now scrolling over the top of it. So this is an example of an image being fixed. So that's a CSS property that we can play with. So in here, we're seeing less height, so we don't see the full image at any time right now. It's not a full height in terms of matching the screen height in here. Let's keep going. Another fixed image that's being revealed. And then again, we get to the same fixed image that was at the start of this example. So again, this is here to show you an example of images that can be fixed into position in the background. So the next example we're going to look at is of an image that is scrolling with our content. So I wanted to show this example from the W3 Schools website, in which case we have an element here and we have a background image over on the right hand side, and this is depicting the default model, which is that when we have background images, they scroll at the same rate and along with the content that is in the foreground. So I can select this, which tells me that this is actually foreground content. The browser sees it, understands it as being text. Over here on the right hand side, I cannot grab this element. That's because that is actually in the background. So what you're seeing again is that the content and the images by default scroll at the same rate, but that we still do have the opportunity to have them fixed if we would like. Okay, so coming back in to take a peek at layering. We can actually layer background graphics or images more than one inside of a single HTML element. So let's say the container, the div with the ID of container, that div element could have more than one background image or graphic applied to it. So we're going to go ahead and take a look at what that might be. So on the css3.info website in here, I want you to take a look at this particular example right here where we actually have a sheep which is being added, a PNG file so that the background behind the sheep would be transparent, which would allow us to be able to see the grass. Now we also have the grass and sky, between grass and sky, which would be this particular graphic right here. Now what we see is that both of them are coming in as background images for a div with an ID of example 1. So this div has been given a width and a height to keep it open, because remember, if we didn't specify a height or a width, this element would only be tall enough to accommodate the text content at the top. We know that, right? The boxes don't expand out on their own unless we force them out. By forcing them out with a width and a height, we've now created enough space in this example to put the grass and to put the sheep, both of them in the background of the same element. So when we get down into background image, we're starting with the sheep, which means that it is going to be in front because it is the first one that we are mentioning down here. And then the grass is going to be behind it, and we know that because it's going to be the second image or graphic that is being specified in here. When we get down to background position, what we're going to see is that we have 2 values, comma, 2 values. So center bottom is going to be the positioning, first on the X, then on the Y. So it's in the center on the X, which we can actually see, and then it's at the bottom of the element. Now, the other one is set to be left and top. That's actually because it's this entire background that's being used for a graphic. So it actually includes the gradient in the background and the grass in the background is all one. So it's coming in, and its top left corner is starting at the top left corner of the div itself. And then for background repeat, both of them are set to no repeat. You can see some other examples of that and other ways that you can play around with that on this page as well. Another thing that I want you to know or remind you about for background images is that they only weigh in terms of file size and the file size impact on the loading of your website as much as the single graphic or image would weigh. So if you are importing or placing or including a graphic that is only 5 kilobytes and it ends up tiling and repeating for, let's say it ends up that there are 250 of them present, visible on your screen, it's still only going to cost you 5 kilobytes. So we get a lot of bang for the buck when it comes to using our background graphics and images strategically. Now, the last one that I have in here is that you can combine a background image or graphic and a gradient for the same element. Now, we can actually create gradients using CSS, and Dreamweaver has support for this in the CSS Designer. Gradients are a little bit different and that they are considered to be a background image and not just a background color. So we played around with adding background colors to our elements. We do that inside of the background category for our CSS designer, and we end up with a solid color. Now, when we start to play with a gradient, where we go from maybe a light value to a dark value, or from blue to orange, or whatever, we can actually create those, like I said, using CSS, but they operate and are thought of as being a background image or graphic and not just a background color, which means that we need to think about them in terms of how we were layering in the last example. So I want you to take a look at this real quick, because this is going to show us how we could add a gradient overlay on top of an image that's in the background. So what we're seeing right now is an image of the elephants, which is placed into the background of the element. And then what we see is a gradient of color that's actually being placed over the top of it using CSS. So it wasn't processed that way inside of Photoshop or another graphics program. It was actually added to the image using CSS. So here is the original image. And then over time, they go through and work with CSS to add the gradient over the top. This is a really nice and subtle technique. Can be subtle, I guess it can also be very overt. So it's very, very, very cool to be able to play around with gradients inside of our CSS and not have to build those out inside of a graphics program, which is what we used to be limited to. If we wanted to have a gradient somewhere, we would have to actually create that gradient and then apply it as an actual image element. So I hope that that gives you a broader understanding of how we might use background images and graphics and some of the power in this technique. So in our next video, we're going to be looking at how I will be applying background images and graphics, and I have samples for you, and you can download the tutorial files and follow along if you'd like. Otherwise, you can just take that information and apply it directly to your website.